but I hope that you can see the slides I've prepared with many images, because apart from first expressing my gratitude to the organizers for sharing this time with you, especially during a pandemic, I'm sure that we are going to have a very interesting time together. The topic today is particularly violent because in the current situation, convergences and dissent between or across social movements presents a wide arena, and I'm going to go through 4 axes, through 4 topics. This is the outline. First, as the previous speakers already mentioned, I want to speak about identity. That's the first thing. This is a common element that also generates divergences. We're speaking about groups and social movements articulated around identity politics. This is the first question. I will be very brief, but I have 64 slides and many images. I apologize to the interpreter already beforehand. But I think this is the first element we need to discuss in this issue of convergence and divergence. Then there is another element that has to do with breaking away from limits, breaking the borders. This brings together feminisms, lesbianism, gay and sexual liberation movements, and again, transsexuality, transgenderism, and also travestism, because this is sometimes annulled in the LGBT acronyms. T is usual transgender and not transvestite. And then I will also be addressing pathologizing and stigma. And I will start with a positive outlook, and I will finish on a bit of a depressing note, but I will try to make this more colorful and try to add some colorful notes to it. The most important problem, as we referred to before, when we speak about identities and categories, we're speaking about politics. This is what Ruth was saying. And this is something the system makes the best of. And the criticism of the political articulation, especially in the 80s and 90s, is not new. We have voices from anthropology, social sciences, and what they have mentioned is how identities respond to the paradox of our times. On the one hand, we're in a society that is more interconnected, in an economic globalization that's much linked to all these technologies and the technologies of charms. This is when our body seems to be divided. Nature and culture are divided by technology. They're outside our own control, but we feel it as our own body. And curiously enough, while we're looking at all these fast movements of transnational movements and movements in populations, virtual contacts, at the same time, while we're going through this cultural homogenization, we're also witnessing a bigger gap in differences and with different categories. In the 1980s, this was something that was present as well, especially from the field of anthropology. This is my perspective too, because the topic of identity does not only place us at the crossroads.
Una cosita, Assumpta, están diciendo que se te ve muy pequeña la pantalla.
Assumpta, the screen is quite small.
¿Puedes aumentarla?
Shall I enlarge it? Yes, if you can do that. What about now?
Porque se ve tu fondo
Why don't you maximize it? Because we can see your computer screen, your desktop.
¿Ahora?
No, para que no se vea tu fondo de pantalla, se vea mejor. Ahora sí.
¿Ah, sí?
Ahora.
Pero lo que no sé yo sí lo podemos... Así, vale. Bueno, pues entonces lo que os decía es cómo efectivamente ya desde los 80 abordar las identidades implica...
Discussing identities means that we have to stand at the crossroads, and there's not just one path ahead of us, but several. This does not affect just theory, but also practice. This definition of the identical that becomes an obsession is part of that. And we also have to see something that Jeffrey Weeks already mentioned in his classical volume, that the search for identity is precisely demarcating the abnormal. And this is something that is outside of hegemony. And the focus is on what's different. And in this sense, we see how these identity politics have a correlation and a co-narrative that is linked to what Mr. said before, of the capitalist system. There's this marketing of identities, of diversity, of the other. And an example is this matter that has been many times underestimated as some fashion or a problem of our times. But we also have visibility. We have this cover of National Geographic speaking about a gender revolution. There are many other images that have to do with diversity as such, for example, intersex, non-binary, transgender women, transgender woman, bigender, transgender man, androgynous, and man. So in this cover, we do not have woman, but we do not have other categories either. Our concern about the mercantilization of identities has led to a moment in which it is difficult to find somebody who claims that they're not feminist at the left. Everybody thinks that they are feminists, and this is a conflict too, because many times in our heart of hearts, we are concerned, or we are annoyed that some gay men become more prestigious because they speak about new masculinities in inverted commas, but they're actually speaking about how to be a new gay, but preserving other elements. So we see how these sexualities or identities are dislocating less in terms of the commercialization. We see T-shirts, we see companies, etc. So what's different is fashionable right now. And we also have all these mechanisms, the charming technologies, which are the technologies of how we construct gender. We have so many things on Netflix. Lesbian series, those are the ones that are more invisible, so I wanted to make it more visible, but we have everything. We have trans series, we have, except for hetero series, they are there, but they're not marked as such. We have documentaries, productions around transsexuality, around the proliferation of different forms of pride, and fundamentally, we also have another aspect that's important, at least to me. We see a positive side to it because things are becoming visible. This is what I was trying to say at the beginning when we speak about identities, but at the same time, we have to ask ourselves from which perspective these policies are introduced for social transformation. What are the interests behind them? And how we bring together contributions that enrich the discourse and social mobilization. And this leads me to another important matter, and is how some of these social movements have managed to embody and give voice to those who are absent, including technology. They've given voice and presence to groups that were just in theories, present in theories, and also influenced by the biases of scientific categories. And many times we see that there are generalizations, but this leads to simplification. This is something I say as an anthropologist, because we still see this in evolutionist terms, in terms of going from less to more, while we have to think that diversity has existed in many societies, in many contexts, without representing a problem as such or a complexity as such. So there's a certain tautology in which searching for the same leads us to look at this evolution of our gaze and using biotechnology as well to reach a different society, but we are not capable of checking what has happened or what other societies have to tell us. And though COVID has shown us that we are human, that we die, incredible, many articles show vulnerability. Well, I see that we're arrogant, Western arrogance, because we thought, oh, nothing can happen to us. And we always move forward. And thanks to technology, we will have a better world, and we will conquer other worlds or otherwise other planets to extract them. So we have an interesting tool in anthropology. As John Vendel was saying, we can see through anthropology that all those typologies have looked at the idea of anomaly. First, they have classified the others, that lot, people who are there and who are going to be granted an identity. So naming something is an important step because this is linked to silence. If you have a name, I'll listen to you. And this is one of the worst damages of domination, because in this naming, there's a negativity that brings together of all these meanings of the Christian flesh, and I'm speaking about our society. It also brings together at the same time, without if we think about this, it eliminates any dissent element or contradictory terms. So it generates fascination and desire as well. This is the forbidden fruit. And the etymology of the closet speaks about the desire around what's forbidden, the pleasure of doing something that you're not supposed to be doing. This is something we also need to consider, because often we see that we emphasize danger or lack of purity, dirt, but there's also desire and perversion, just like there's consolation in the definition of illness. So medicine can become an element of repression, because right now what we hear more often is that this is bad, but medicine was also a sort of enchantment. I think that you've already read that a guy in Catalonia has 2 dolphin fins because he thinks of himself as post-human. So when we speak about post-humanism, we have to see how we are reacting. And we have to go back to Foucault again, because he said we are condemned to speak about sexuality. We're condemned to multiply our categories, and this proliferation of categories is what we are witnessing today. In this sense, I think that we have to go back to strategies. This is something that we will need to go back to from the 80s onwards. We are trying to identify who the most important enemy is, our main enemy, as Christian Delphi used to say. And this affects our daily life as well. How do we organize ourselves for subversive action so that we plan and face the enemy? And I've got Putin, an image of Putin, because it's not difficult to see that Putin is a main enemy. And as a summary of homophobia, transphobia, sexism, and all these aspects have always been resisted and responded to with attitudes that are shared by trans movements and feminist movements. And this has to do with humor, irony, sarcasm, pride, and self-designation. I'll try to be fast. So in order to break the limit, we've seen that we're now witnessing an apparently paradoxical moment, but it is not so much. So we convince ourselves that we're something, but at the same time, we belong to a community where we have a larger segmentation. For example, we have Bears Against AIDS, or Wonder Woman, and how this comic was introduced, who wrote it, what they want to do. Polyamory seems to be a very new invention, but it's not. And also the need to feel part of a community, such as we have with these trans summer camps, and that's very important. I also think that another interesting approach, and this is an intersection between trans movements and others, LGBT movements and feminist movements, in their aim to create their own genealogies. And also, and going back to archives and the different demonstrations, we have a sample here of some interesting texts, Cuerpos Marcados by Silvia López and Lucas Pratero, Lives That Matter and Public Policies, Transfeminismo Barbarie, Transfeminism Barbarie. And this is, of course, important for us to get the blind spots of history of what happened in Spain in particular, not just in the 60s and 70s. I think that there are reasons for hope here and for pride, because we've got more publications in terms of journals such as Sex and Sexuality, or publications around the transgressions of sex, and they show a change, a radical change in the way knowledge is produced, in the way in which we invest in academia, something that comes from the social movements. If they insult it, then make it yours. This is, we can go back to the mad woman, this hysterical woman, and we've claimed that. Yes, I'm mad, I'm the crazy woman, and I'm hysterical. The same thing can be said for gay men and the initial meaning of gay. Nobody says in English nowadays, oh, I'm feeling gay today. But it is a very interesting understanding of how they appropriate language, and trans movements have gone back to the monster and the abject. So if we go back to the 19th century genealogy and trying to categorize everything and psychoanalyze bodies, we have Paul B. Preciado's text, I'm a monster speaking to you. It's a way of seeing who is keeping the voice, who's appropriating the voice of those groups, who is appropriating our voices. We have this feminist motto, take your rosaries out of our ovaries, and this is part of a feminist movement, and it has to do with the fact of stopping others from telling you what to do, in this case, the church. But it also links cultural references. We have, for example, great performance around flamenco. When we study flamenco, we see how those limits, those borders were fluid, and there was much more sexual freedom in the past, and something more terrible, such as, for example, Prada writes about a surprising woman and wonderful woman, Ana Martínez Sánchez, and he appropriates her voice. And I think that this is another interesting crossroads. Another confluence I'd like to mention is the joint cooperation and subversive cooperation against normative violences, and being audacious and saying that we transgress and we all want the same. We want to be fathers or mothers. We have, for example, this Instagram live stream of gestating fathers, and the cooperation between Marc Camprole and the colleague to write a book. I will go back to this later. So that sex, gender, and sexuality stop being this trilogy of death that we sometimes find. So we always have to speak about sex, gender, and sexuality. And then I will develop this in a minute. But I think that this is another confluence, another intersection that we have, and what we have written about lesbians, about women, about gay men, about trans folks, about intersexual people, and how this has been happening throughout time, because sex, sexuality, law, and injustice have been filled with taboos and with erotic sexualities that are observed. As Nancy Shepherd-Hughes, Death Without Crying, the beginning of this, in the beginning of this book, they start saying at the beginning, we have insult, when you know that faggot is something that's detestable, regardless of your sexual orientation. And this is like lesbian or tomboy, it would be, I think, more equivalent to whore for women. And I think that anthropology speaking, this is very interesting to see how these violences that are based on an insult that is before the conduct itself. And this is a language access, it's also contention access, so that you do not look like a whore, so that you do not look gay. And I think that this brings us all together, and we have to go back to it, because after that we've managed to create references, more positive symbols, and in order to change these politics, sex politics and gender politics, with new models, and going back to all these cultures of radical sex, unfortunately, they now populate common imaginaries. And this is positive. I think that we have to see the positivity in this, and we have a very important change now in exploring sexuality. We have some books here, Bad Califia, The Second Coming, Gender Knots. I think this is a very interesting series in order to see each of us how sexuality belongs to us. We are made of skin and flesh, and we desire before anybody constrains us and models us and constructs us. So all these books that have dared to speak about SM, and when I speak about sadomasochism in my classes, people find this a bit scandalous. But for me, I think there's nothing more masochistic than when children play mom and dad or role games where nobody has power, where we have a pact. Okay, now you explore me, now I explore you, and there's nothing to say. So children already do that. They are always playing SM, children. And then we think that there's something super heteronormative and super normal, nice, rockabye baby on the treetop, and all these cruel lullabies. But anyway, this is another matter, it's another discussion. I think we have to have the body present, and I've chosen these pictures by Lucas Platero, and how we break with those dichotomies, because many times from academia we interchange categories and practice. There are many women who have a masculine gender expression, not just in their body, but also in their behaviors and their ambitions, and the other way around. There are men who look completely feminine. And I think there's a problem from the perspective of theory, not so much of practice. But it is good to have it there and to speak about all these transsexualities and linking them from a specific group to see how everyone transvestites at some point, depending on the goals we want to achieve in a particular context. This visibility is becoming more important, especially, for example, with TV and TV programs and awards. And we really need to think about this as a space that has to do with the second wave of feminist movements, making the invisible visible, and this also intersection with Foucault. I think that Susan Stryker's work is, of course, very important, especially in terms of how they can articulate from their own experience the challenges and the differences that we find across these movements in time, and how we can find the roots for a new revolution. Everybody knows that first Beatriz and then Paul Preciado was very important in Spain, because this was a generational break, even if not everybody was happy with it, between what was institutionalized feminism and the ways of creating other references, other texts, other manifestos. I'll skip this quite fast, but I think that many trans movements have known, have been skilled in taking the methodologies of women's workshops, men for equality, LGBT movements in general, and they have created workshops that we can find nowadays. There's a large array of workshops for cross-dressing, feminized, masculinizing workshops, drag queen, drag kings, to have that in our lives, and also gender queer workshops or gender neutral or non-binary individuals. And this has more to do with the spiritual transitions and with dichotomous elements, and that's why I have the picture on top. We have all these things together. I think that another important element is that we have academic journals exploring this, that they're specializing in transgender studies, and that we have a genealogy and a history, the memoirs by trans people, for trans people, and for everyone. And in this sense, now we'll go with dissidence and confrontation. One of the problems we had was how queer theory arrived in Spain. I think that this is an important aspect we need to consider, because it was Preciado, when they reinterpret what Monique Wittig was saying, for example, from feminism, when she claims that lesbians do not have a vagina, or that their passion for the dildo, they say that there's no truth, no gender truth in terms of feminine and masculine, and this is a set of cultural fictions. This is going to lead to all the resistances that we see nowadays by feminists. I think that this is something that we need to consider and go back to minors, speak about minors. Luckily, I'm in touch with trans minors, because that is what they would be showing academics, because we have to look not at the bodies, but at the person. In trans visibility, we also have many examples, for example, the Movimientos, or also visibility, political visibility. Kim Perez, she's the first trans woman who was part of a list, and she's on hunger strike right now due to transphobic action, and also the role of Manuela Trasovares. In 2008, she was councillor in a municipality, and she always used artivism and her work as an activist. So when we speak about transgender, and we have new models, we have this flag of transgender pride created by Monica Helms, with the 5 stripes and the butterflies, etc., takes us back to the fantastic Foucault work, My Memories of Herculina Barban, and see when we find the need to confess that there's not just one sex, and to understand that intersexuality has always had a different political presence. I cannot go into the details of this, but I think that we are having a new voice around, that we're listening more to what happens with intersex individuals, and that we have symbols too, where the I does not mean invisible, but visible, and at this crossroads. I know that I'm behind, so I'll try to be fast. If we look at diseases and AIDS, let me skip all this. This is another element of confluence of these subversive identities. And I would just like to show the body of Gail Rubin, because we also speak about her, but this is her. We don't see her body. I think that this is very important, because Gail Rubin is showing us that categories might separate us, but the bodies don't. Gail Rubin was the creator of the sex gender system, but in the 80s, she says that sexuality is a vector of oppression. And I think that we also have to mention the contributions of Donna Haraway, Simone de Beauvoir, showing all these confluences and tensions that we will have between trans movements and feminisms. Let me move fast, gender technologies, and the opposition that we have and fractures that we're seeing nowadays. There's an open war between a section of feminisms who feel proud of being trans-exclusive, and on the other hand, the transphobia that we see as criticism and the different ways of doing feminisms. But right now, we are in the middle of it, and we have to see what arguments they're using to oppose, for example, a trans act, because raped women wouldn't have safe spaces, or because hate against women is eternal. This is a new essentialism that's terrible. And that the degree of violence with which TERFs are criticized. And so you're a slut, disgusting TERFs. So this is a hard moment, and it's not promising, especially due to the hate declarations that have happened against Lidia Falcón. And she criticizes the Ministry of Equality and to criticize everything. And at the same time, she has been used to speak about queer phobia. This is a new category. And especially, we see that younger people are claiming that they're not a theory, that trans children and teenagers are not a theory. And then what's more dangerous is that some feminists are aligning themselves with the far right. And this is something we need to analyze too, and that is populist right-wing trends. Let the battle for Spain begin. This is what the fascist party Vox says. So they created an icon Gaysper to go against all sorts of ideas against diverse sexualities. So let me begin by claiming that we think about utopias, not towards the future with this Western progression history, but looking around us. And we have this declaration by Juana Ramos in 2015 when she says, I think that, for example, Trans October is another way of showing an alliance or the transversality of transsexuality with other social movements, with the environmentalist movement, trans-feminist movement, of bicycle users, of migrant people, squatters. That is, the reivindications in our Trans October are those of the social movements that are not particularly trans. And this is very important for me, that the fight, the struggle has been transversalized. Thank you, and sorry because I've spoken a bit too much.